It's a great pleasure to have Pamela Smith give some concluding comments, which will then lead into a kind of roundtable discussion and question and answer roundtable. Professor Smith, of course, is the Seth Low Professor of History and Director of the Centre for Science and Society at Columbia University. As I'm sure she needs no introduction, she specialises in early modern European history and the history of science. And her current research focuses on attitudes to nature in early modern Europe and historical techniques. She's the founding director of the Making and Knowing Project, the founding director of the Centre for Science and Society, and chair of Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience. Her publications are numerous, and of course her book, The Business of Alchemy, Science and Culture in the Holy Roman Empire, published in 1994, I think, and then recently republished in 2016, of course, has been foundational to much of the conversation that we've been engaged in today. And as have her co-edited works, particularly Merchants and Marvels, Commerce, Science and Art in Early Modern Europe, co-edited with Paula Finland, and then, of course, her book, The Body of the Artisan, Art and Experience in the Scientific Revolution. She's continued to edit and publish prolifically on these themes, and has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, which, for time's sake, I will skip over and just introduce Pamela and say welcome. Thank you, Pamela.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Let's see. Okay, I'm supposed to talk for 12 minutes, so just stop me. I have my stopwatch going. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you, Mark and Andrew, and to all the speakers for their just abundant feast. I was just saying to Jessica, this was a day in which everything I love was mentioned. And so I have to stop myself from trying to respond to each individual lecture because I took very copious notes, or I have to stop myself, especially from talking about making and knowing for the next hour. So I want to summarize, first of all, a few points that I think were very important. Not necessarily, new points, but were very well illustrated in the talks. First of all, Mark mentioned to begin, he quoted Quiccheberg, quoting Cicero, about the preparation of an orator. And of course, this forms the context, that is, the reading of Roman texts in a civic environment for the practice of ruling, what Cicero's orator and De Officiis was all about. And of course, the method that's associated with that preparation of the orator is collection of copia, and in order to act, in order to develop judgment and prudence for action. So this is, there's a straightforward connection here between the interest in experience and practice with respect to self, to household, and to governing of a territory. This was, of course, as is well known, extended to collecting natural specimens in this new discipline of natural history. And, of course, the preeminent exemplar of practice was the art and craftspeople, so Techne. So the first point is, of course, the connection to what we call humanism. The second important point, the connection to pedagogy. And Quiccheberg actually talks a lot about how much these objects can just teach. For example, he talks about engravings as and pictures as able to impress themselves on the memory more than the daily reading of many pages. And that's one reason you should have paintings and sculptures of all kinds. And this method of this pedagogical method and the teaching of the habits of thought that Andrew talked about so eloquently in thinking about the Kunstschränke as fostering a kind of thinking with and through objects, and that you can see so clearly in the correspondence of Heinhofer, and especially in his, fostering that habit of thought, and selling his Kunstschränke to princes, I think is very important in terms of the dissemination of what is effectively a new epistemology of objects. Then third, I thought that wonderfully brought out today was this narrative of progress, and in some ways, interestingly nuanced in the work of Las Casas, for example, and that we have here in this wonderful painting. I mean, this in itself is a narrative of progress. I mean, there's that wonderful big trip hammer, which is new for pounding out armor, this new steel armor of the late 16th and 17th century. Of course, the porcelain, all of the things at the front are displaying the progress that's made through the arts. So, these images, this is 1616, but of course, going back much into the 16th century, you see the argument for the progress of Techne and the arts being made in the objects and the images made by artisans. Fourth, the utility for the common good, the importance of oikonomia. I really think that's so central to all of this, and which is an argument that we heard again and again. Fifth, the union of contemplation and practice, the union of scientifica or theoria and practice in the Kunstkammer. And Quiccheberg, again, says this quite explicitly. This is collecting is new, but it's really, a first philosophy, and it's opened the doors of wisdom and science. So he's making his argument, as Mark brought out, in very explicit language. Sixth, the sphere of practical ethics, the overcoming of the division between virtue and appetite that was wonderfully brought out in Vera's talk about the Cameralists. And finally, seventh, I want to just make reference to, art and power, referred to, I think, we discussed it in terms of Alessandra's paper, the fear and wonder that is occasioned by or engendered by art and techne, the potential for, power and deception, in part because art is transformative, generative, it's, supremely mimetic, and therefore very open to deception. And it's also, bound up with materiality, with appetite and desire. And I really think that alchemical discourse, both the discourse about alchemy as deceptive, as well as the, obviously view of the central kind of power of alchemy that we saw in Anna Matisse's paper, just in those objects that were made for princely courts. Alchemical discourse is absolutely central to articulating this view of art as powerful and deceptive. So I just want to raise a couple of things that, just two things actually, that I think are important. Let's see. I don't know whether I have my slides in any sort of order here. So, of course, we have to think about, this is 1505, this is the Bergbuchlein of a physician. And I think that, these kinds of texts about new subjects, there is no ancient corpus. There is no corpus of ancient books about mining, right? So it's a new subject. And it actually, if you look at the images in this book, it very much forms a model for so many of the representations of mining, up into the 16th and 17th centuries. Similarly, distillation, surgery of Brunswick here, but again, a new area of knowledge and new claims by someone who is a practitioner. And then, of course, printers. I mean, printers are central to claiming this kind of knowledge and power for techne and for art. And this, there's just the incredible work of these printers in terms of, I mean, this is just one example of images, but I mean, they are the kind of nexus of entrepreneurship, claims to knowledge and ingenuity, and then also their own techne. And of course, Biringuccio, who is so central for thinking about metalworking. And then finally, I just want to say that, the craftspeople, you knew I was going to get to this, right? The craftspeople are really at the heart of this discourse about techne and prudence, and they're already claiming it in their works of art and in their books. And of course, everyone is familiar with Jamnitzer and his work on, let's see, do I have it? The writing box, of course, his ingenious inventions for basically figuring out the amount of metal that you need based on what is basically we call specific gravity today. Of the specific weight of a metal for figuring out what are the equivalent amounts in an object of gold, silver, and copper, his perspective devices, his incredible representations of all kinds of ways of measuring. This is from his book on the Kunstschrank, the Schreibtisch, his manuscript. And so, making claims to, as Nicholas Neufchâtel shows here, making claims to all kinds of inventions and, of course, learned knowledge as well of books. But I want to just give you one example of we see here, obviously, all of the things that we talked about in terms of technique, but let's think about prudence. And I want to give you an example from Jamnitzer on this as well. In 1556, Jamnitzer began an ambitious chamber fountain for Emperor Maximilian II, but it was only delivered 22 years later to Rudolf II in 1578. This is all that remains of it. These four, the base, in which he depicted flora, spring, abundance, and generation, Ceres holding a cornucopia, Bacchus, and Vulcan. So couldn't be better in terms of the useful personifications of useful arts, human arts that form really the framework for all of human life. And there is there's also the description of it, which is of this fountain. So we have a good idea of what it looked like. It was apparently 10 feet high and 5 feet across, and this is not actually the design this is a design for a table fountain, and this is a terrible image. Oh, well, that was my time up. I'll just finish. This is a terrible image. I mean, the thing itself, I took photos of it in Basel, and it's huge. I mean, it's like 9 feet long, but and you can't really get pictures of it, but it's beautifully, beautifully colored with all kinds of butterflies and generating metamorphic insects at the base, and it's absolutely fabulous. But, so we can imagine that it somehow looked like that, his table fountain, although even larger. Maybe it looked like this, his chamber fountain, maybe it looked like this design for a chamber fountain of Matthias Zund, much more elaborate and clearly and much larger. Okay. And then, of course, jurors designed for a table fountain. Here you see all of the scenes taking place and all of the little figures hanging off of it. But let's go back to Yamnitzer's chamber fountain. Okay, so he says that in the description, which may have been written by Yamnitzer himself, it displayed not only physics and metaphysics, but also politics, as well as many wonderful philosophical and poetical secrets displayed and proven to the eyes. There were 4 tiers, and the highest one represented ruling, and so on down to the lowest tier, which symbolized earth. Cibeles was there, surrounded by a grotto, all kinds of mining implements, including native specimens of silver and gold, little silver and gold flowers cast from life, looking as if they were growing naturally along the little brooks. And along the brook on Yamnitzer's fountain were polishing mills, a stamp mill, a sawmill, and a hammer mill, all driven by water. So those little models were there. And then little peasants dancing were also driven by water, dancing the pickle herring and the Roland. So, we have to think about how did that fit into this cosmic, this representation of Techne at the base, connected to the materiality of earth, on up to ruling and prudence of the Habsburgs. So that's 1568, 1556 to 1578, the making of this fountain. And so I think that we can see the way in which this view came from the craftspeople themselves. I mean, they were also formulating this epistemology in their works of art and in their texts. Thank you.